Welcome back. Views, interpretations, and opinions expressed are not advice nor official positions presented on behalf of any organization or institution. They are for informational and entertainment purposes only. Now, join Ryan and Peter for another episode of the Tracking Wisdom podcast.
So, I had mentioned to you that my wife and I had joined the Tony Robbins seminar, highly recommended. And I recognized something. This is a recurring thing, and we've talked about it before, but since we're looking to talk, I can bring it up again. So he was talking about problems, challenges, difficulties in people's lives, and how we have our reaction is to minimize challenges and observe them or perceive them as negative things, as things to get rid of. And he was talking about how important it is for those challenges to come up for growth. Like, you really can't grow without being stretched and without kind of pushing those limits outside your comfort zone. And he was sharing much of his past and experiences, which was very difficult growing up and has kind of led him to where he is now. And in many ways, what he does is something I aspire to do or be for people, that kind of source of inspiration and problem solving and helping people to be the greatest versions of themselves. And I find it difficult for me to find my pathway into that realm, much because I feel like I don't have the problems that so many people have, which I know, boo-hoo, but at the same time, I have this like strong drive and internal pull towards that kind of work, but I don't know how to get there. It kind of goes back to our discussion about our colleague who's like promoting and telling you things, but they don't actually do them, right? Like, to connect with people in that way is important. Frequently or often having that sense of accomplishment. I went through this, I can relate. This is how I was able to overcome it, and so can you, versus somebody who's like, I've heard of these things and I've never really experienced them, and this is how I've never experienced them.
So I very much identify with that kind of historically, because I've always felt like I've had quite a privileged life.
Right.
Now, part of that is minimizing.
Sure.
So I'm going to throw something out there in the spirit of our trusting relationship.
Sure.
And it's a little bit tongue in cheek,
okay,
but also like not. And it's like, well, so my thought, this just came to me, is how much we talk about the sun being behind the clouds and the gold being covered and obscured, and that people have this inner wisdom that most of the time they just can't hear it because there's so much noise, because life is so distracting, or because conditioning is so distracting, and the challenges that they have. And so it occurs to me, hypothetically, it's like, well, maybe you have freaking challenges and they're just obscured by your fundamental well-being, because you have but they're obscured. So they're there for you to find. And this goes to what you said a couple of times about you're not dealing with conditioning. And I think for very good reason, because it's not in your face. Why go looking for trouble? Right? And I think a lot of us who go into shadow work, because it's not because like, oh, I want to have an awakening experience, so I'm going to go into shadow work. It's like, I'm freaking out. I don't know what my freaking problem is. Somebody help me, and then somebody guides you, into shadow work, which is what we've been talking about a little bit off mic. So it occurs to me, which is not something that I've ever heard of. So, that's another like mentor question. Did I ever talk to you about the finder's course mentors office hours? So anyway, on Wednesdays, mentors from the Finders course do have office hours, and I might go and ask this question. A friend of mine.
Well,
just asking for a friend of mine.
Asking for a friend. And I mean, I want to be clear that obviously I've encountered things that are challenging.
Right.
What I observe is that the things that I've encountered that are challenging and the way I observe the vast majority of people that I've experienced, how they react to them is not how I react to them. And therefore I get a different experience.
Right.
The problem that I see, or the challenge in being that inspirational person, is that I didn't have to overcome it. Like, as far as I can remember, this is how I interacted with these things. So how,
I see.
you know, how do you be that? How do you present as the person who overcame the challenges, and so can you? If it's like, you know, well, that's the point.
Okay.
And
That's interesting though, because it's interesting the difference between our perceptions of that. I think because when you started this, I was like, oh yeah, I know, I feel the same way, and now I realize, oh, we're talking about different things. So I'll follow up with a different thing. So if your goal is specifically to, or your intention is very specific to helping people overcome obstacles where you haven't had experience in overcoming obstacles, that's
hard.
a challenge. But why is that? Why is that a specific goal? I mean, because
it's just something that I have felt a draw to, and it's not like I want to be the, you know, it's a very, I mean, we've talked about it previously, that I observe suffering and I want to be a source of, I feel like I have some amount of awareness and understanding of how this can be resolved or minimized, and I want to help people. But maybe obviously that specific archetype or you know, identity isn't for me, but something in that realm. How do I find that niche?
Exactly, because you have a lot of available examples or models that don't match your circumstance.
Right.
So, you know, you're not going to be a Tony Robbins because you didn't have the kind of experience of overcoming challenge. You're going to be a different kind of helper, which kind of goes to the story, a couple of stories I was going to tell. So one was, and it's very much along these, in the same vein of, you know, in being a mindfulness meditation teacher, certainly in my experience, in coming into a program and you know, kind of, getting on a path to becoming a teacher early on, I absolutely had the same sentiment or feeling of, how can I relate to difficulty, or how can I help people overcome difficulty when I've had a very easy life? And of course, you know, when you go into a program with 1,000 people, there are going to be a lot of people who had it a lot harder than you did. You know, especially if you're already self-identifying as, I'm privileged. There's going to be a lot of people who had it worse than you. And so, of course, you know, I heard some stories. And so, but the funny thing, kind of funny to me at the end of, so we just had the closing ceremony and we heard from some program alumni. And they're pretty different backgrounds and demographics of the kind of teaching that. So one talked about she teaches children meditation to, it sounded like school age kids or even preschool, and then another teaches lawyers. So she's a lawyer and she's an active lawyer and a law professor and a consultant, and teaches mindfulness. Wow. And then another has a nature reserve or some kind of, I'll just say nature reserve, And as she puts it, speaks for the trees and the butterflies and the bees and like all this stuff. And then the fourth is in Washington, D.C., and is an activist, and his work is to speak truth to power and walk the corridors of the government and teach mindfulness in that sphere. So really different stuff, right? And then one of them told the story about how they had a stroke. He said, so just to keep it honest, like honestly, like the reason I value the practice is because, I don't know if it was a year ago, I mean, it sounded fairly recent. Like I had a stroke, and it's not that it wasn't terrifying, but I was actually able to be present with the experience of having a stroke because of the practices. And it's like, he's telling the story, like, and recovery from the stroke and all this stuff. And the next person speaks up, and they'd all like already introduced themselves and stuff. And well, that's really interesting because I have an unruptured aneurysm in my head, and I have another unruptured, and she was like I have a 1 centimeter unruptured aneurysm in my head and a 2 centimeter unruptured aneurysm in my neck. And so every time I get vertical, I consider it a blessing. And and it's like, oh my God, like, and then the next person said, well, I didn't mention it before, but I was unable to walk for 4 years after giving birth to this. And it's like, and it was just like, it was a little hilarious because it sounded like this competition of like, challenges, as you're saying. But it was kind of shocking. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe that's what you're going through, So what was my point? Well, I was going to tell that. So that was a story I was just thinking of telling. And then oddly, you introduced this idea of having challenges, and it seemed to match a bit. So what did you said, Tony said it's very important to have those challenges to experience development, right?
Yeah.
And just to introduce a couple of metaphors with that, like as you're growing, you have to have weight-bearing stress.
Yes.
For your bones to develop properly. And as you age, you have to challenge your bones with weight-bearing stress in order to maintain your bone integrity. And, a butterfly needs to struggle against the chrysalis to survive.
Right.
So there's a story of someone, finding a hatching butterfly emerging from the chrysalis, and they help it, and they remove the chrysalis, and the butterfly dies because it's not biologically viable for it to have the chrysalis removed. So just to say that Tony's point obviously is well supported by a number of examples from biology. So what I was talking about before was how, all right, so I told Ryan off mic about basically getting into touch with some legacy trauma and not realizing that having a parent who went through war experience actually gave me legacy trauma. And when I went into it and confronted it directly and deeply, I realized I'm not going to do it now, but when I was telling this story to Ryan, I was like starting to break down, just recounting the experience of having this realization and insight and contacting for the first time what that experience was for my parent. It did not happen to me, but my parent was a war survivor, and unexpectedly, I mean, to me, it's very, very difficult to imagine that I would actually directly carry that trauma, but I found that I did. And I really was describing this as 80% of what? I guess why I am maybe critical or angry. There's some problematic aspect of my personality where I could see, okay, some of it's due to my direct experience, but 80% of it was due to what internal family systems calls a legacy burden. And it was really, really strange to have that experience of discovering that I was actually experiencing this generational trauma. Because in theory, it sounds like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But to actually experience it and go through the emotional breakdown of directly confronting it and reconnecting with it for the purpose of healing was very, very weird. And I guess my point is that I think it's probably common. I can say it is common for those of us who are called to helping profession or helping paths. We feel unqualified. Like, how can I do this? I don't have the kind of suffering of the people that I think I'm going to be helping, right? And I think it's like, yeah, that's just because you don't know. I mean, I'm going to postulate or hypothesize. It's not the right word, but that, the reason that we have this calling is whether we know it or not, we have that suffering. And maybe part of the work on the path to becoming a helper is looking for that. It just sounds kind of weird. It kind of sounds like, oh, I have to go find some trauma, but it's not that. It's not, oh, I have to find some trauma because I want to be good at this. It's more that you want to be good at it. Why do you, what I'm suggesting, what I'm proposing is that the reason that we want to be good at it is because we carry this trauma and we don't know it, right? Like, that's the karma, that's the cause for this calling that we feel. Like, oh, we actually are suffering, we just don't know it. Like, to our naked eye, we seem to be privileged in terms of, like, I had an easy life, I never had any, poverty or physical insecurity or, dangerous environments and things like that. But, maybe there's some in your background. And then the point I was making to Ryan before was that if I didn't make a point of contacting this legacy burden, I would never have known that it was there. And that everyone we meet, even if they seem to be from very favorable circumstances, and even if they come from, family legacies of ease, that's where it's most likely that they're unaware of ancestral trauma, And I guess the other thing is, and this is, trauma can also take different forms. Like, perpetrators are also traumatized. But I think in terms of, I don't know, I don't want to state this too strongly. I guess I just want to say there's a possibility of being called to helping work, and maybe we should actually try to really do some deep work and understand what specific burdens we carry, because they may not be visible. And it's not a contest. I mean, the thing is that connecting with suffering, how we relate to suffering is the gift. That is how you help people with struggles. It's how do you relate to the suffering. It's not the struggle, right? It's the suffering of the struggle. And so I guess what the point is, even if you don't have struggle, you have suffering. And even if you don't have visible suffering, you probably have invisible suffering. And my proposal is that if we have a calling, then that's probably a marker for invisible suffering. So this will be interesting. like this just came on the fly in this conversation. So it's like, oh, we'll see if Ryan gets into some therapy and uncovers some legacy burden that was.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on at least one of the intuitive responses I had to that question. Like, when I was thinking about it in the seminar, my initial reaction was, well, you had to have overcome something. And, like, basically saying to myself, if you think back and really kind of reflect on, you will probably be able to find the thing or multiple things that you overcame, and it's just not in the conscious awareness at the moment. And then the second response, which is basically the complete polar opposite is what we had talked about before, and we were talking about earlier as far as the non-doing, and when I talked a couple weeks ago about saying I just need to be in my light, or being who I am and not trying to be somebody I'm not is enough. That is the path, or that could be the path, is the path. And this new thing with fiction writing and stuff could also be a pathway of helping to communicate my philosophies and understanding in the existential questions, and kind of addressing those things in a safe way, right? And in a way that doesn't have to rely on my own personal anecdotes, but that you can bring the inquisition, the process of inquiry, to an audience in a fictional way, using fictional but relatable experiences, and kind of allow that process to unfold for the reader, may also be part of my path.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, awakening teachers and non-dual teachers don't generally deal with suffering very much. And that's not the content of their teaching. And so maybe that's just not the content of your work. Maybe it is, as you say, another valuable gift or lesson or teaching is just being. Yeah. And, your ability to model that is just a different gift. Yeah. I mean, your gift is what it is. Yeah.
And I'm grateful for it.
I could go find another gift. I don't like this one.
I'm going to regift this. No, and of course I am very grateful for the gift.
Yeah, quit whining.
I know. It's a good problem to have the issue of, I have a gift that I want to share, and I'm struggling to fully understand how best to share that gift.
But okay, let me think about this, because I definitely have this impulse with you to pursue this, and I don't think it's just what's the word? I don't think it's egocentrism. I don't think it's like, well, this is my experience, so it's got to be the same for you. But there's something about, I mean, the fact is you do keep on bringing it up, and it's like, conditioning, that is.
Yep.
Like your relationship to conditioning, or kind of as you describe it, your non-relationship to conditioning, and it's like, okay. Me thinks he does protest too much. I know. No, I mean, so maybe. I mean, there's two possibilities. Maybe there are three possibilities, but at least there's a possibility that you just don't have conditioning.
Yeah, I don't think
and then there's the possibility of you have a hell of a lot more conditioning than you think you do, because you just have no reason to confront it, because you have such ready access to fundamental well-being. And I don't know what the third possible one it would be. I guess you have
something in
but
the
not,
middle.
not something in the middle. But yeah, so there are some thoughts. This is like a can of worms I don't want to open right this moment, but there's some directions I've thought of going with you in different conversations that I'll just kind of like leave that teaser there. I'm curious about it, though. I mean, we're both curious about it, which is interesting. I'm curious
because, even when we talked earlier off mic and you were talking about self-criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, that's a fairly, I think, common marker of or experience of conditioning.
Yeah.
And I really don't have much, if at all, of that.
Yeah,
and that doesn't mean that there's no conditioning, but my point is that, why is that?
But when I said, but do you criticize others, and then you laughed, because you do criticize others,
but not myself.
Right, but not everybody has to have every kind of conditioning.
Oh, I know that.
Right, so so you just don't have all of your negativity is turned outward or whatever. I don't know.
It's everybody else's fault.
But I mean, that is a way of being. There are people who don't experience any sense of depression, anger turned inward. They just are convinced that it's everybody else's problem. And yeah, I don't think it's, I think it's interesting, but I don't think it's necessarily hugely significant that you don't have self-criticism, right? I mean, there's lots of things that there's things that I don't have, right? I mean, I don't have body image. Like, I don't have a great body, but I don't have a body image problem. Like, I was like, that's fine. I don't care. But I mean, like,
that's fair.
My mentor has body image problems. It's like, how the hell do you have a body image problem? Like, it's people are what they are.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, very strange though how we do have what we have, right? And I guess also the other thing is everybody else's conditioning is strange. Like, I can sympathize with it, right? But it's like, how can you not see how wrong these things are? Like, how can it not bother you? How can you not want to be fixing something? That's my, it's like, how is it possible? I mean, Jesus. It's just like constantly walking up to a sink. How is this okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my external critic has probably gone through iterations. And it's definitely been, I mean, obviously, we're both familiar with the time 10 years ago where I was in a much different place mentally at work, right? And there's clearly frustration. I think there was criticism. I know there was criticism, but I also feel like that criticism was legitimate. I had legitimate gripes that I felt like weren't being addressed. And I think that my interaction with that emotion now is much more mature. But I don't know how much of it was actual progress from me versus culturally.
The problems start to go away.
No, it's so
that
what
didn't happen.
So what? No, it always. So that was not my. I wouldn't call that my baseline interaction with that kind of thing. And in part, there were cultural elements of where we were that started to drive that kind of behavior. And internally, I always kind of felt like it wasn't the right response, but it seemed to be the response that was rewarded by action. And it wasn't ever addressed until it was by two very close friends of mine. And then I was able to snap out of that because I always had this underlying sense that this wasn't the way to go about it, but nobody was correcting me on it.
So here's a question. Did you experience that as suffering? Because it seemed to me that you were suffering. That's what it appeared. That's how it looked to me.
Yeah, I mean, it probably, this is going to sound like a stupid answer. I would say not in the way that I imagine suffering is for people, but it was probably as much suffering as I suffer.
Yeah, that's a stupid answer. No, I'm just saying that because interesting.
Frustration.
Yeah,
Frustration because I felt like it was very obvious and that I was hearing one thing and seeing another. And that it has always been a source of frustration for me because what I hear is I want this, but I'm doing everything counterproductive to doing that. Yeah. And that is just something that rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, and I really identify with that, and I really also identify with the other side of it. This is weird. So I'm just thinking about. So here I am graduating from, my mindfulness meditation teacher certification program,
officially,
and so I'm in my office for like 3 or 4 hours, right? And then I come out and basically I hear I hear my kid being rude to my wife, and I scream at her. I like tear into her, like, you got to stop. You got to look at your behavior and stop. And I'm like, cognitive dissonance much?
Yeah.
So so I'm thinking, God, from her perspective, how frustrating must that be, right? I mean, Jesus, literally screaming at her that she had to change her behavior. And literally after just graduating. Oh my God. But but this is the reality of the human condition. I mean, this is one of the things that I learned. It's like, that's not abnormal.
Right.
Which is a weird thing. And it's not making an excuse. I mean, look, it was really wrong to yell at her. I really regret. And thank God I was able to apologize. And she was fine with it, which I'm not sure how to feel with that. It's like, okay, is that a sign of deeper trauma or is it just generosity? So, which I think honestly is both. One thing that concerns me is that I really want to work with her to surface these things and have actual conversations about how traumatic it is to have someone exactly that, graduating a program and also screaming at you and like, ugh. And I mean, to the point, this also goes to the whole legacy burden thing, because it's only in the past month that I've become aware of my legacy burden. And so obviously I haven't been, in not being aware of it, I couldn't have been completely successful in stopping it, and so this has been a big stressor for me this weekend, because I continue to work with Internal Family Systems Therapy book, and I'm learning about the impact on developing kids, developing internal family systems, their system, in the environment of a dysfunctional family system. I'm like, oh, shoot. And then I'm like, meanwhile, I'm like enacting it at the same time I'm reading about it. It's crazy. So that's a major stressor and so the challenge. Oh, yeah, challenge. We were talking about challenges. A challenge is, to understand this and be responsible for it without being guilty about it. And I understand that it's not my fault in terms of this is the way friggin' people work. Like, we have wounds and we pass them on. And then if we're lucky, we get to understand them and heal them and hopefully help other people heal them. That's, but the healing part, I would say, unfortunately, is more of the exception.
Right.
The rule is all the rest of it. And so the challenge is like taking on the responsibility and not attaching the guilt to it. And anything else?
What does that look like? So what I heard there is kind of like what I experience. So you're saying like the challenge is to get to where I am, but that there's more I need to do, and I want to know what that looks like. Like, I don't attach the guilt to it, and I can take responsibility for it, but then what's the next step?
I got a little lost. So what?
So we're back to talking about me.
I was about to bring it back there anyway, but
so acknowledging that there's some underlying conditioning, right, to address. And when you're talking about you and your conditioning and your historical trauma, what is it called? Legacy trauma. That the key step is to accept the responsibility for the activity, but not attach guilt to it. Right. Not turning inward judgment. Right. But I feel like that's where I am with my conditioning. Like, whatever conditioning I'm dealing with, it's not, I can accept the responsibility for it, and I'm not turning it internally. So what's the next step to dealing with conditioning? Because I expect that that's probably not the end of how you deal with conditioning, right?
Yeah. So I'm not sure. So from where I am right now, I'm not thinking of conditioning as conditioned behavior. I'm thinking of conditioning as, the psychic burdens that are causing
Sure.
the conditioned behavior. And so I think because it's what I'm doing, what I would say is you have to come into contact with the burdens that are causing the conditioned behavior. What are the origins of the conditioning? What are the origins of the conditioning? That's the question. So to your point, right, so you observed this conditioning expressing itself in angry behavior, but you haven't been able to articulate exactly what it is, because as I think maybe you didn't point it out, but obviously, as you know, not everyone would be as angry in the same circumstance.
Right. Yep.
And so why was it triggering to you? That's the question. And it's interesting. It's interesting that you bring that up, because I didn't remember that. And this is what I was going to say before was, God, I forgot about that. Man, if you had told me then that you were like in fundamental well-being, I would have been like, what the fuck? you crazy. Yeah, like, what are you talking about? Of course, neither one of us had anything on our radar about this stuff. But yeah, interesting. But so the big question is, are you seriously telling me that one time in 10 years you got triggered?
No, but the trigger is the same. So I was doing the trigger journal originally, right? Remember?
Oh, yeah.
And I think I put like less than a handful of triggers down, because it wasn't the frequency. It was like the same thing. Like
Right.
The same kind of trigger.
Right.
And what I would say, whatever that trigger is pointing back to whatever it is that I can't see that you're talking about. That's the root cause. Whatever it is that causes me to, because the physiological and the emotional reaction is the same. It's a frustration. There's a frustration about something that I see. Somebody wants something that their actions aren't aligning with. And that is frustrating to me. But why? I don't know.
So this has the same flavor to me as the multi-thread model, and some people having many threads, and some people having only one thread or two. Well, he says hypothetically, or I don't know, maybe he knows people who have only one thread, but it's uncommon. Right. And I think about what kind of triggers and conditioning do I have? And they're pretty different, right? So I have a lot of outwardly directed anger, and I have a lot of inwardly directed guilt and criticism as well. It's not just one, and I probably have other stuff too, but those are the obvious ones for me. And so you're saying, you just have this one type of trigger. I'm like,
it seems that way.
That's interesting. So maybe that is but I mean, maybe that's the difference, is that just like with the multi-thread model, if you didn't have the multi-thread model, having a single thread experience wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Like in most traditions, or rather, if your thread weren't either emptiness or oneness, or I guess maybe psyche, then you'd be completely lost. Right. And so maybe in terms of, the way we come into contact with conditioning in the ideas and teaching that we work with, the fact that you have only one specific, maybe it's so weird and so hard to deal with because most people have multiple, and you have only one, and that just it's not a common model. And so it's very hard to wrap your head around or to identify or work with, right? So it's interesting that maybe Pierce's model opens a little insight on that. But
yeah, it's weird. But I think that you definitely are touching on something as far as kind of like my quality geek, the root cause kind of thing, right? That underlying, there's something underlying that's driving what I outwardly observe.
But I think more than that, what's interesting is that not only is there something underlying, but there's some like major masking.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's significantly obscuring it more than typically, right? Because we, like, oh, you need to do some shadow work. It's like, oh, it doesn't work because
I don't even know how to address it.
So that kind of points towards an area that I want to explore more, which you mentioned earlier. I mean, we talked about internal family systems, I think, multiple times because it's one of my major models that I work with. But now I've been getting more into it. And so maybe that's something that we could look at together because reading the textbook, he says, now as you learn internal family systems, you should practice it with your friends and family and I'm like, really? You really want me to practice internal family systems with my family? I don't know. That doesn't sound like it's going to go well. But maybe it's something we could play with. Sure. Or you could read the book. Personally, I found the book really interesting. I mean, I think it's just well written. The introduction is a very interesting historical sequence of how it was developed and touches on things like the rise of systems thinking in the 70s, which I was not really aware of. Anybody points it out that, before that, people were very mechanistic or thought leaders were very mechanistic around how they looked at problems. And there would be like, it was reductionist approaches. Like, oh, if we take this apart into its parts, then we can understand exactly how it works.
Right.
The watchmaker kind of attitude. We'll just take apart, just lay out all the parts and it'll tell you exactly what's going on. And in the 70s in systems theory or thinking or whatever it was, the rise of ecology as a science and the understanding of interdependence in a scientific way, right? Not in the Buddhist traditional way. And so, so it's I found it a very interesting story. And then, as you get into the practices, I just think they're really interesting. The case studies aren't, you see this in self-help books a lot, where like there's some theory and there's some examples or case studies or whatnot. And in the past, I find these kinds of things really dry and really hard to read. And this one I just really like, but it also might be because I've been working in that modality for a while. So it's just more like, oh, now I get to see how this whole thing actually works. And now I, like, oh, this is what they're talking about, where I've been kind of like doing exercises without really knowing why they work, or how they were discovered. Yeah. So I don't know whether you would find it as easy to read as I am, but I'm finding it really kind of engrossing. So it's a possibility. Obviously, there's a number of possibilities for how we might explore it. So we can, just put that in the hopper for something to do.
Be interesting to get at this thing.
Yeah, specifically, if you wanted to do the work, I actually want to learn to guide the work, and that's So I'd love it.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure how. I'm not sure what time frame is.
Right.
And I would want to talk to my mentor. It's like, okay, how do I go? But good news for you is I do have a mentor.
That's true.
Because that's the other thing. Oh no, that was part of the teaching. I did a mini workshop on one-on-one teaching, and one of the things was, so if you're going to work with people one-on-one, you want to make sure you have a mentor, so that if you run into stuff you can't deal with, you know who to talk to, and I do. So
nice.
Anyway.
Sounds good. All right. Till next time.
All right. Very good. Thanks a lot. Thank you for listening to the Tracking Wisdom podcast. Join us next time as we continue the discussion. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and visit www.eth-studio.com for more information and content.